Hello and welcome to another episode of the Fully Charged podcast. There's quite a lot of activity that goes on behind the scenes in every industrial and governmental department, as I'm sure you can imagine. That's not public facing. So we often know about the sort of public facing stuff of big companies and car makers and electricity companies and where people you buy your electricity from, but we don't know what goes on behind the scenes with the organization of things like a grid in a country, or the kind of background of energy generating and how it's done and who pays for it and where the money goes and how it all fits together in a marketplace. And one of the most complicated marketplaces I've ever thought about, tried to understand, listened to people talking about is the energy market. Because I can sort of understand. You make cars, so you buy iron ore from a mining company, and you buy plastics and rubber from an oil company, and you buy electronics from maybe a Chinese company, and you put that all together and you make a thing and then you sell it. And that's kind of, it's complicated, but it's sort of understandable. And you've got to sell it for more than you make it for, or you go bankrupt and all those things. That I can understand. Energy markets, mind-boggling. And I had a really good education in this, and really an education in realizing how little I understood earlier this year in Oxford in the UK, when I attended a conference, Aurora Energy Finance. Aurora, what are their energy analytics, I think is their official term. I'm just going to make sure. No, it's not even that. It's Aurora Energy Research. So they spend, and there's like not one or two, there's 300 of them around the world in this organization that study energy markets, study new technologies that are being introduced into the energy sector, study the impact that solar has on the coal industry, or the impact that wind has on the gas turbines, on the impact that renewables and storage has on the nuclear industry, and the impact the nuclear industry has on the gas industry. All those relationships, incredibly complicated. How we pay for electricity, how the electricity price is set by the most expensive generating form, not by the cheapest, but by the most expensive. Who makes the money? Who's making the money? Where the investment's going? They're giving advice to governments, to companies, to big banks, to hedge funds about where they invest their money. And is it sensible to invest in renewables, for example? And that was one of the things I learned that day is, yes, it definitely is. That's where the big money is going now. Other than nuclear, it's going into renewables. It's not going into coal and gas. And so I really wanted to try and dig deeper into that. The reason I was at that conference was because I was on one of the panels about electric ground transport, and it was embarrassing because the people there were proper, clever, well-informed people. I was at the very bottom of the food chain, if you like, of that particular gathering. I mean, there was thousands of people there, and my goodness, I wouldn't be possible to meet someone who knew less about everything to do with the energy transition and electric transport and everything else, materials needed for batteries, materials that are put into wind turbine manufacturing, everything, recycling wind turbine blades, all those things. So I then got in touch with the company behind it, Aurora Energy Research. And I talked to a few of them, and there were some alarmingly clever, very young people, which we mentioned in this podcast. I mean, I'm talking, they looked like they just left school, and they were so well informed and such confident public speakers. Fascinating. So one day I hope to get some of them on the show as well. But I just spoke in this episode to Dr John Feddersen, who is the CEO and founder of Aurora Energy Research. Am I saying research? Yes. Because I say research, but then I've suddenly realized I'm saying research, which I believe is the more American phraseology, and that is slightly worrying because I don't do it consciously. Aurora Energy Research. Yeah, you'd say research in American, and we say research. How interesting is that observation? I'll tell you. Here's the interestometer. Pong! It's just fallen off. It's dropped. We talk about long-duration batteries, price cannibalization, the business case for baseload providers. Do we need baseload? they are how to avoid getting Russian gas into Europe, how to not use Russian gas to produce the heat and energy that we need. All these things are fascinating. Nuclear power. So if you're interested in this topic at all, you're going to be fascinated. And what is brilliant, John's got a real skill, because clearly he is alarmingly well informed about these things, and there is a whole language of internal language that's used in the energy industry to explain market trends and price caps and all that. Really complicated. We don't do that. We don't go there with that. I don't think there's anyone who's competent at basic understanding of English who won't understand what we're talking about. And I mean, I needed it like that because I don't understand a huge amount of it. It is a very complex topic. So that is the introduction to this. I'm going to mention, because just before we start, I'm going to mention My Energy, because we've been sponsored by My Energy for a long time on this podcast, and I know that is coming to an end, and it's fantastic. We're not upset. We're very happy that they've supported us for so long, and we're very happy that this podcast now can support itself, and we don't need to have that direct injection to keep it going. But I do want to kind of say a massive thank you to them. What they're doing is amazing. They've been winning awards recently, which is they really well deserved. And all I'll say about them is just go to the My Energy website, because it's really interesting to see what is on offer, what they're doing, how popular their stuff is. I'm amazed when I see a video of someone who's got a Tesla in Australia or New Zealand or America, and they've got a Zappy charger. They've really, why have they got a Zappy charger? Why did that person choose it? Because they're really good and they really work. This is a wall-mounted charger you have in your house. And if you've got solar panels, you want a Zappy, and an electric car, you want a Zappy, because that's what makes the two things work together so well. Have a look at all their other projects, all their other products, including their new battery, which I've now managed to forget what it's called. It's the Libby, isn't it? I think it is, the Libby. And the Eddy, which is a controlling system that's in your house that does. I've got an Eddy here. It's really clever. Don't know what it does. It's in a cupboard. Never makes any fuss. So if you go to myenergy.com, myenergi.com, it's all there. Don't want to go on about it too much, but just a big thank you to My Energy for supporting the Fully Charged show the Fully Charged podcast over the last year or so. And then I just want to quickly mention that we will, you may notice when you hear or watch this podcast that Dr. Feddersen is Australian. He's from Melbourne originally, although he's lived in the UK for a long time. And we are going to Australia, and we are going to be at the Sydney Exhibition Centre on the 11th and 12th of March next year, in what is now, I can confidently say, going to be an amazing show. We've got incredible people speaking there. We've got such a huge amount of stuff on display. I'm really impressed. There's a kind of really exciting explosion of interest in renewables, in energy storage, in electric vehicles, in electric ground transportation generally, in massive mining vehicles that are electric. I mean, amazing stuff going on in Australia. Huge amounts of solar. Not surprising. And so we're very, very excited about being there. If you're in Australia and you're anywhere near Sydney in March, do come along. It's going to be amazing. But that's it. So let's get on with this week's podcast, which is, let's just welcome Dr. John Feddersen from Aurora Energy Research to the Fully Charged podcast. So, John, thank you I know you're an incredibly busy, high-pressure individual, so it's very kind of you to find time to talk to us. I mean, I just want to give a little bit of background, because I was so sort of, I don't know what it was, flattered, honoured, and feeling hugely inadequate when I spoke at your conference in Oxford, which was amazing. I mean, I had I was dizzy with data when I left that place, because I got, everyone I spoke to, horrifyingly intelligent and well-informed. Everyone whose talks I watched, fascinating. One talk I really wanted to get into, I couldn't get in the room. That was a talk about batteries. I just couldn't get in. It was in between two of my talks. It was just jam-packed. It was just a wall of backs, standing room only. So that was, and I think shows interest in the topic.
Yeah, I heard about that one, and unfortunately, my job is to, if it's ever packed, because it's my event, don't enter the room. So I
Yes,
miss
yeah.
out on all the most packed ones. But I mean, Robert, the honor was all ours, and I mean, it's such a good day. I think for any energy nerd, it's a
Oh,
bit
it was
like
fantastic.
Disneyland for the day. That event is what we've tried to create. So
Yeah,
it
no,
was
it was.
delighted you were there.
Oh, it was a great joy to be there. So, but can you give us a? I'll let you explain what Aurora is because I kind of know, but I know I'd get it wrong.
Yeah.
So if you can, because it's such a fascinating. Anyway, you explain what it is because yeah.
Yeah, so we're a subscription research business in the power sector, and the premise. I mean, you go back to the start. I was studying in the UK when I started. I was just finishing my PhD when I started the business,
Right.
and the premise was basically power markets are getting a lot more complicated.
Yeah.
So we were moving from a world in which most of the power generated was from large power stations. They were run by fossil fuels primarily or nuclear. The grid had been built a long time ago and there was enough grid capacity. And what was changing was the sources of generation. Renewables are more complicated in a sense to think about from an analytical perspective because they produce power when the weather is conducive and they don't when they're not. And they're also built in places where the grid didn't exist.
Yeah.
And similarly, other technologies like EVs and batteries that were starting to integrate with the grid came along. So the premise was things are getting more complicated. And I thought, along with early investors in the business, if we can take the modeling very seriously, then we can help people make better decisions.
Yeah.
It worked. So we've grown. We're now about 350 people globally with a presence in Europe, the US. We've never raised capital. We've always been profitable. We've just continued to grow and serve our client base. And so what we really help people with is long-term decisions.
Right.
Whether that's a private sector investor saying, does it make sense for me to build a battery in this particular location, given the revenues, or will a wind farm be profitable there? They might ask, what would happen if government increases or the European Parliament increases the carbon price? What does that do to the business model for the thing I'm thinking about investing in right now? And policymakers also, government will often ask for our view on what would a particular policy or regulation do to the market, prices of electricity, those sorts of things.
Right.
The one thing we don't do, Robert, we do a lot of analysis around forward-looking analysis in power markets, but we're not advocates of anything, right?
Right,
So
yeah.
the premise behind the business is it's a subscription model, and so no one is more than 1% or 2% of our revenue base, and so no one has editorial influence, and that was a very deliberate decision early on, because we think that's the best way to think about the future. So we're not here to say how fast we should go towards net zero. We're not here to say what the carbon price is. We're not here to say how much a pensioner should pay for their power bill. We're here to do the quantitative analysis that hopefully helps inform democratically elected people around those sorts of decisions.
Yes. No, that's a very good description. I understand that, and I'm hoping our listeners will. I'm sure they will. I mean, can you give us an idea, though, of because you mentioned your client base. So that I'm assuming power companies, I guess even like investment people who aren't necessarily power, but are thinking we want to invest X million in a wind farm or a solar farm or whatever. Is that the sort of area that your clients are?
So we've got I think over 600 clients now globally, and it's people who are invested in producing electricity. So your traditional utilities like your British Gas Centrica and your SSE and your RWE in Germany or Iberdrola in Spain.
Yeah.
It is a lot of people who are in the developer or the renewable investor ecosystem. So there's a group of people who are developers that ranges from everything from the guy in Cornwall who knows how to shake hands with the farmer to secure a lease on the land to build the solar farm, all the way. And at some point, they're starting to build a solar farm. They wanted to bring in investors and larger developers, all the way through to big infrastructure funds like BlackRock, who deploy capital globally. Suppliers like Octopus, for example, in this country. And the big oil and gas companies. And as you'll know, the Shells, the BPs of this world are getting increasingly serious about the energy transition, and,
Yeah.
and they subscribe to Aurora services globally to help them make better decisions in the electricity space. The
Right.
networks is another one, I should say, but there are relatively few networks because they're monopolies. So it's the whole gamut, and government I didn't mention, but
Right.
governments around the world subscribe to our services because they find it a useful way to get insight into the long run decisions they're making.
Right. And it sounds like you're mainly focused on electricity, on generating, distribution, sales of electricity. What about, because I mean, it's still a hot topic. I saw in one of your list of topics was Europe and Russian gas, or how can Europe function without Russian gas and all that stuff. So presumably you are studying the gas market as well and what's going on in there. Is that part of your remit, would you say?
Absolutely, Robert. And you can't understand the electricity market, as we've learned very seriously this year. You can't understand the electricity market without understanding broader fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And you can't understand it equally without understanding some of the end use sectors, right? And I think there's a very interesting question around the role of electric vehicles in the grid, and a number of open questions that flummox forecasters like us in terms of what role vehicles will have.
Yeah.
So we need to think much more broadly than just the electricity sector. And probably the most important historically and this year and probably going forward is fossil fuels. What is the cost of fossil fuels? Because they, in a lot of markets, drive the price of electricity. I know that surprises some people. That in a 40 or 50% renewable system, the price of electricity would be determined by the price of gas and the price of carbon 90% of the time. But that's the fundamental economics of wholesale markets.
Yeah. And that is, I mean, I've had that. I've discussed this at a painful length on the podcast in the past, but why that is the case, that when the gas price goes up, and, I know people who are in the renewable space, and I sort of ask them, has the price of generating electricity from your wind turbine gone up? No. Why am I paying so much more then? But I mean, I do understand it. It's because that is what the two of the talks that I heard at the conference. Because I think of that conference as like I was an attendee. I only spoke at a couple of things, and but I mean, it was so exciting to hear, because it was the primary thing is, oh my God, this is a complicated topic. There is no simple way of explaining the energy market and how it works. And the kind of legacy of it as well, the decades of negotiating and price agreement, and it goes back a long way. We've built our entire world around fossil fuels, and the process of not using fossil fuels, of transitioning away from fossil fuels, is really complicated, painful, huge, expensive. It's a monster topic.
And it's interesting. On that transition, I have one of the benefits I have is that I see a lot of different markets at a lot of different stages of the energy transition, and you see the challenges from a 10% to a 20% to a 30% to a 60% renewables system, and the themes are quite similar, but there's sort of big challenges at every stage. So I know there's going to be a decade or two of more big challenges coming up in a lot of parts of the world. So it is complicated. But I think, Robert, on the question of why despite the fact that the cost of the wind and the sun hasn't gone up in a world in which we're 40 whatever we are 40% renewables in Great Britain, why are we still driven by gas price? I think a big chunk of it comes down to a lot of consumers don't know what they're buying when they're buying a green tariff. And so you may well have covered this on the show, but to some extent, there's the idyllic vision is I've bought green power that matches my consumption profile, sort of firmed green power, which is reserved for me. So it's there whenever I want to use it. And that's what 100% green tariff is. And it turns out that, what people in most countries, when they take a green tariff, buy is a green certificate, which gives a claim on the output of an existing renewable asset, doesn't necessarily make sure it's matched hour to hour with their profile. It's
Right.
obviously a lot cheaper to get that than it is to get firm green power, which is a lot more expensive. And I think that's part of the confusion in general here.
Yeah.
And of course, green power generators, if they know they're competing with gas generators and the price of gas has gone up, they want to charge more for their power. I mean, I suppose it's the same. Tesla's profit margins are 6x the profit margins per vehicle I hear of other manufacturers.
Yeah.
I don't expect Tesla to reduce their prices just because they could produce nice cars more efficiently than others. It's the same deal in the power market to an extent.
Yeah. But then there's some terms that one of the key arguments that I've been sort of deluged with, and we've just done an episode about nuclear power, and again, I want to state here for the audience as well as you, because I think people have assumed I'm sort of anti-nuclear. And I always want to underline, no, there's only one type of fuel if you want to say I'm anti, but in a realistic way, because I know we totally rely on it, is fossil fuels. I'm happy to be classified as anti-fossil fuels, but I'm not anti-nuclear. But it is that is a fascinating debate because it's entirely down to the economics as far as I'm seeing it, that the economics and the speed of deployment, that we are now suffering. And as this is happening around the world. We're suffering from not making decisions 10 years ago or 20 years ago, like we should build more nuclear, or we shouldn't build more, make the decision. But it feels like we've crumbled towards, something's happening. The Chinese and the French are building a nuclear power plant and it's costing unimaginable amounts of money. It's not far from where I live, it's down the road. So I don't know. I mean, because that was one of the, so I did want to ask you about this because it was one of the talks I could get into quite easily was about nuclear, and it was fascinating, and there weren't that many people in it at the Aurora conference. But what I got from it was people who are in the nuclear industry, clearly pro-nuclear, want to promote the nuclear option, but were basically quite depressed. They were it wasn't that thrilling. It was like, well, we're trying, and it's going to take 20 years, and it's going to cost £40 billion, and they were quite negative, and I thought I was waiting for some positivity from them, and it was a little bit dowdy. But I bet you've got a different take. But what do we do about nuclear?
So at a very high level, I think nuclear's got as you say, it's got the issue of these very long planning horizons.
Yeah.
And if global history is anything to go by, there's some sort of nuclear scare maybe every 20 to 30 years. All right, is what we've seen in human history. And Fukushima was the latest one. Obviously, Chernobyl was the biggest one.
Yeah.
And it's very hard to stay the course on a long-term project in the context of something like that happening. So there is a fundamental problem that the politics of nuclear, given the timescales, you just can't get away a bunch of nuclear reactors in a 5-year period.
Yeah.
And in a democracy, it's very hard to maintain public support over the 10 to 15 to 20-year planning horizons there.
Yeah.
I don't think so. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges, right? And we're seeing ways in which government tries to address that as a stake. For example, in the UK, the Sizewell C plant, which is the one that will come after Hinkley Point.
Yeah.
Government's taking a big stake in that, and so they're committing and driving. Whereas Hinkley was very much a sort of George Osborne off the government balance sheet type structure. So that's a fundamental problem. The economics of nuclear are actually, they're not too bad. Yes, it's getting more expensive, but I think, and again, to your point of the power sector is complicated, decarbonizing the last 10, 20, 30% of the power sector gets very hard. So there's been an argument historically that the levelized cost of electricity from solar and wind, and even onshore wind, is materially below the levelized cost of electricity from nuclear. That's true. So, in the UK, if we're talking UK numbers, 40 to 60 pounds, maybe it's $50 to $70 US for each megawatt hour that comes out of a solar farm or a wind farm or an offshore wind farm. Nuclear, it's materially above this, 50, 100% more. You can make arguments about scale economies and things like that, but we're yet to see, maybe we're seeing that in China to an extent. So it's very easy to say, onshore wind is cheaper than nuclear, right? And that was the argument. The problem is, once we get to a certain level of renewables penetration, it's not the cost of the wind turbines that's the issue. It's the ability to integrate them into the system. And you see that in a couple of ways, right? So one is we need to build network to get to the wind, and it's typically in new places. And another one is just public acceptance at some point. It's not just a British problem; it's a German problem, it's an Australian problem. Anywhere you've got a democracy or a particularly densely populated democracy, it seems like, maybe Spain's slightly different, but it seems like tolerance of large infrastructure onshore, whether it's wind turbines or high voltage transmission, becomes a problem. And so. And as I say, that's, I reckon, about 50% renewables penetration in the system. It varies. So to get above 50, there's a school of thought which says, okay, we just need to persuade people that we can build big infrastructure onshore. It's not bad for them. Or we need to change the permitting regime. I'm always a little bit skeptical of any public policy solution that starts with, if only people would just, because, people are who they are.
Yeah.
There's another version of this where you say, okay, well, let's assume that we can't get past that and that there are political barriers to high voltage transmission online to onshore wind. For example, Robert, the last 4 high voltage transmission lines from Scotland down to England have all been in the water. They haven't been built over land because it's much more expensive to build them in the water, but you can actually do it, right? And you don't have to go through a planning regime. So there's another version where you say, look, we know we need to get past 50% renewables penetration over an annual average, and we know we can't build, or we know it's hard to build onshore wind and high voltage transmission online. All of a sudden, the economics of nuclear at that point, the economics of offshore wind, to some extent, the reason we build offshore wind is because of public acceptance. It's not because of cost. It's more expensive than onshore in general. You say maybe this has a role to play, and so you need a politician who's prepared to make that argument and say, look, this thing is more expensive per unit of electricity, but it means you're not going to have a whole bunch of visible onshore infrastructure because of the energy density, and that's when nuclear can start to come into its own, is in my sense. So, maybe there are naturally. So I think there's a role to play, particularly in a net zero system, and particularly consistent with public acceptance. But I can see why the dynamics are a bit dour. When you try to build a nuclear power station, there's there's one guy trying to do it, and there's a lot of people who are anti you. And so you never get the political kind of cohort, the contingency like you get with renewables, where you've got a massive sector with people doing lots of things. It's always one versus, it's EDF versus the whole rest of the industry. In a lot of markets, including the UK, I think people say any support for nuclear is support that won't go towards other low carbon technologies, and so it becomes a little bit adversarial. I think that's partly where the debate is in general. But I'm pleased to see a number of countries, the Netherlands, for example, the UK, taking nuclear seriously, because it is one of the proven baseload zero carbon technologies out there, and to some extent, we all hope that hydrogen and CCUS and these technologies will evolve to the point where they can provide better economics on zero carbon dispatchable technology. But for the time being, nuclear is really, really one of the few that we have.
Because what I'm intrigued in is how you sail through quite occasionally stormy political waters, remaining kind of neutral on the technology, which is in a way I try and do as well, except for I relish being very negative about fossil fuels, but everything else, every other aspect, I want to be positive about and like promote, but the one that's become really peculiarly charged is hydrogen, and I can't work out now. I'm sort of because again, one of the second non-combustion car I ever drove was a hydrogen fuel cell car. It was a Honda Clarity. When I started doing the second episode of Fully Charged is about hydrogen, so I was definitely not opposed to it, and it was a fantastic car. And they had a hydrogen fueling infrastructure in Germany where I drove it, which was effectively a waste product from chlorine production. So it was a huge
Yeah.
chlorine factory, and one of the waste products was hydrogen, which they put in a tank and you filled your car with. And I went, this is the future. This is brilliant. But that was in 2010, and it still isn't here. But I don't necessarily want to talk about hydrogen in vehicles, because I think that is, a debate that you and I don't need to discuss. But hydrogen for heating, I'm having real emotional problems with. As in burning hydrogen in a boiler is not making a lot of sense. And some quite intelligent people I've met and spoken to, including some people who are at your conference, are very negative about that. And I don't know what your take is on that, and how well, in a sense, it's not so much whether that can work or not, it's how do you discuss that without being slightly political, because it's so politically charged, it seems.
Yeah, and look, there's on the heating side, and I'm not an expert in hydrogen heating, certainly as you infer, if you form your opinions based on what people, if I were to form my opinions based on people who I respect are saying, then I would be very anti hydrogen heating inside for various reasons. And look, part of it is the politics of going into people's homes. It just gets very difficult, right? And I think part of it, the success of decarbonisation in transport compared to the failure of decarbonisation in the home, whether that's insulation or boilers or cooking or whatever it is to do with the politics of, don't come into my house.
Don't come in my
house.
house.
Want to run it the way that I do.
Yeah.
I think part of the hydrogen debate, and I see both sides of it to an extent, which is hydrogen is very expensive. Zero carbon hydrogen is very expensive. Okay, so you've got a market at the moment. I'll give you some rough figures, but grey hydrogen, which is the stuff we make from methane reformation, it's heavily carbon intensive. It's what you would use for industrial applications now. Yeah. Maybe you can get it delivered to you for $1.50 a kilogram at the moment.
Right.
My team at Aurora tell me green hydrogen in a sunny place like Spain is maybe in the $6 to $7 range per kilogram. So 4 to 5 times more expensive. And that's where it's produced. So you'd want to be producing, hydrogen's obviously not known for its density. You just have to look at the periodic table. And so it's very hard to store. It's very hard to transport. And so, unsurprisingly, there are people out there who say this is not the lowest hanging fruit of decarbonisation. That's true. This is incredibly expensive. So that's, I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is people who say we need to get to net zero. I've just said before, the first 50% renewables will do that. Right? It doesn't matter which country you go to. It doesn't matter what government support there is. You can go to Africa, where Tanzania or something, where willingness to pay for decarbonisation is relatively low. People will still be installing solar panels, potentially storage. That's just going to win for the first 50% of the grid. And then I talked about the next bit, which is, you need more networks and you need to integrate renewables. The last bit, the last 10% is really hard, right? Because electricity is expensive to store. Even in batteries, it's incredibly expensive to store for a long period of time. And so those last, there's 8,760 hours in a year. That last 876 hours, or 10%, is when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing. It's probably been 2 days since the wind blew, right? Yeah. Because you have these, Australians call them wind droughts. Germans call them Dunkelflaute. It's the same gist. You need to decarbonize that if you're going to get to a net zero system, and batteries aren't the answer. And so a critic, someone from the other side of the argument would say, okay, that's great. Yes, hydrogen is 5 times more expensive, but it's the best thing we've got to store electricity or energy over these long periods of time. And we're in a climate emergency, and we just need to do what it takes. And so to some extent, I don't think the latter would say that the costs are low at the moment for green hydrogen. No one would argue that. But what they're saying is the urgency is higher, and so we need to do more. And I think that's where sometimes you see cross purposes in terms of the focus on hydrogen. I'm actually pretty bullish on hydrogen in general. The US government, and maybe we have time to talk about what they're doing, but they've passed the biggest climate legislation probably ever in the last 6 months, the Inflation Reduction Act. what they've done is they've provided a $3 per kilogram tax credit to green hydrogen. So to get it from the $6 to the $3, so it's starting to compete. And the nice thing about it is hydrogen electrolyzers are a technology that looks a lot like some of the technologies that have seen massive cost declines. Lithium-ion batteries, solar panels. It's modular. You do more of them, you probably learn how to do them better, and you come up with more efficient ways of doing it. So, I'm in as much as you can be bullish about a technology that is miles away from competitive on cost, it looks like one of the ones that certainly has the most potential. I think we're going to find out over the next 5 to 10 years because there's no shortage of government support on both sides of the Atlantic. But in terms of home heating, transport. You will know better than me, Robert, but it looks like it's lost the debate there, is my sense. And then home heating, I think on a number of grounds, in addition to cost, the network infrastructure required, some of the danger involved. I would defer to experts, but certainly the people I respect most when it comes to energy commentary seem to be pretty anti the idea of heating our homes with hydrogen.
But I mean, it is, when I visited large battery packs, large battery installations for grid level batteries, because I've got batteries in my house and they'll run my house for, if I was careful, maybe 2 days, not even that, actually, a day and a half. We'd have to be careful, but they could do it, and it's great, and that isn't what I use them for. And I'm balancing my usage all the time with those, but when you see a really big battery, there's one new one outside Oxford, not far from you. There's a big one out near Cowley. But I'm really bad at maths, which is why I could never be a researcher for your amazing company. But even with my bad maths, it doesn't take me long to work out this in the grand scheme of energy consumption. Even in one city like Oxford, this is not very big. This is a very small. But this is a AAA. Trying to run a car, it's tiny, and it's that scale. That's what I've not really understood yet, is whether you could get up to sort of, in a sense, gigawatt hour level energy storage with hydrogen. Because I mean because we've just been through it. We've just had the classic example in the UK the last few days. I mean, I have so many apps that show me renewable generation and energy consumption. And it was really, really low. The lowest I've ever seen wind was about 2 or 3 days ago, for about 3 days. And you just go, that wouldn't work. If we didn't have gas at the moment, we'd all be very dark and cold. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. So, I mean, to give you some maths on that, Robert. My team here did an analysis, and they said, let's take the most difficult. Let's take a world in which we've got on average 100% renewable. So we've got over the course of a year, our renewables, if they weren't being curtailed, would produce more electricity than you need in Great Britain, like a lot more. And then let's look at the most difficult week of that of an average year with that amount of generation. And so it's it's the February week where the wind doesn't blow and it's pretty cold, the Dunkelflaute. And what we did was we said, okay, right, let's assume battery costs continue to go down for the next decade. They've come up a bit lately, but continue to progress. What would it cost us to build enough batteries to keep the lights on for those 7 days? Right. With the wind not blowing and not a lot of sun coming out. And what would it cost us with gas engines? And it was £750 billion worth of gas engines, so of batteries, £750 billion worth of batteries, and it was about £40 billion worth of gas engines. So for that week, batteries have an enormous role to play, but for that week, gas engines right now are about 1/20th of the cost. And so if you believe lithium-ion costs will come down by 95% or more than 95%, then which won't a lot of this is labor and there's only so far you can drive the cell cost down, then yes, they could totally replace that technology. But if you don't believe that, and I don't, then we're going to need, and we want a net zero system, we're going to need another technology to get us through that period. Now, nuclear can play a role there if it's running base load, and that's partly why I think it has a role to play. Certainly, it's a good insurance policy where the public's willing to accept nuclear as a source of generation. But it's why there's great enthusiasm for hydrogen, because in a net zero system, that's what you need to look at. I think the other one that is interesting is, carbon sequestration. Now, what form it takes, direct air capture has that sort of modular, potential. I think when it comes to project-specific CCS, we're going to need to see some big projects actually happen. There's been a lot of talk over the last 10 or 15 years, but not a lot delivered. It may be the case that we just say, look, those hours, that week that's difficult, we're just going to run the system on gas or diesel or something like that. And we're going to sequester the power, the carbon throughout the rest of the year. And it'll be a net zero system in general. The atmosphere doesn't care very much. So, so that gives you a sense of the size of the challenge with batteries in general in the system.
Yes. No, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious. It's not, that it has a role in grid balancing. So over the hour-long here and there period, I think they have an enormous role, and it's been proven in Australia the extraordinary impact they've had there. But to run a country for 4 or 5 days is it's going to. Just crazy. Yeah.
The other one that's interesting though, Robert, is the vehicle fleet, right? Because that is massive. So and again, I know your listeners probably have had enough of maths, but there's 30 million cars in Great Britain. Let's just say each of them has a 50 kilowatt hour battery pack, right? And they're getting bigger, right? That's something like 1.5 terawatt hours of capacity. And GB is about 330 terawatt hours a year. So it's 2 days. It's 2 days worth of storage. The thing I don't know, and you will know better than me, is vehicle owners' willingness to prop up the grid with their batteries. But what I do know is at some point in the future, when the vehicle fleet is largely electric, there will be an enormous amount of storage in those vehicles. If it could be unlocked, then it means the burden on other long duration storage is a lot lower. And so I could see a big role there. It's just, I think my sense is, I'd be interested in your thoughts, but my sense is vehicle owners don't necessarily want to prop up the grid with their vehicle batteries. Maybe a peak, but
I mean, I think the what's fascinating is, and I've been hearing that very recently, is the number of big car manufacturers who are building in bi-directional charging into the infrastructure of the car right now. It's not software enabled. It doesn't work now, but they've done it. And Ford, in particular, with their incredible pickup. It's only so incredible because I climbed into one. It took me about a minute to get up. It's so huge.
How big's the battery? Do you know how big the battery is?
I think it goes up to 150 kilowatt hours. Wow. I think there's various ones. I think there is 150, and there's we're actually looking at the General Motors electric Hummer, which I think is the battery, and that is even bigger. But it has to be because it's
the range is still 50 miles. It's so big.
It weighs 3.5 tons. I mean, you can drive it up Mount Everest, but anyway. But the what was fascinating was their response to their TV commercial. So I've talked about. I don't want to go on about it on this podcast. I've mentioned it before, but that was one of the key selling points for that car. They've had 200,000 orders for the Ford F-150 Lightning. And they reckon like 50 or 60% of those sales are specifically because people can run their house off
it's
their
sort
truck.
Of American independence, off-grid type marketing.
So, I mean, I think there is a sign that that's possible. And it's the fact that they're all talking about it, and Hyundai in particular and Kia are already building in bidirectional just as a standard thing. So you can literally plug a domestic plug into your car and it will run it'll boil a kettle or run electric barbecue or something. And that, I think, we will see that. But I still think, and there's, I don't know if you saw, we've done an episode about Utrecht, the city of Utrecht, that are running a car sharing bidirectional charging.
Okay.
They're starting to do that. So all the cars that are parked on the street, the posts that they plug into on their dedicated parking spots are all bi-directional.
Okay, and they can just take it from you if they want
it. Because it's not your car, so they're not taking it from you. They're taking it, so they can use that battery, the aggregated source, and they're aiming for sort of big, in the thousands of cars, and then it becomes a noticeable impact on like peak demand. You can actually start to shift that.
I mean, it's interesting. The one area where I think it could play a big role is in a crisis. I mean, I don't. To some extent, I don't. At least in my experience with an EV is, I want it available to drive when I want it available to drive, and a few quid here and there on selling my power isn't worth it for the inconvenience. But so I was in. They run the power grid out of the California grid. I was in California a few weeks ago at Folsom, California, where the network operator is. They had a very difficult September, and they wrote, so it's a 40 gigawatt peak is the peak demand in that market. And they wrote to everyone, it's text messages or something on the day saying, hey, pre-cool your house because the evening peak's going to be nasty. They think, so the CEO of that organization, from recollection, said they knocked 3 gigawatts off a 40 gigawatt peak by just sending out SMSs. And so I could see if you've got enough EVs on the grid that actually you could knock the whole thing off in an hour or two, we are seeing this kind of, it's not digital, it's a sort of analog behavioral response of people turning down their air conditioning. You could see that sort of thing at peak. So maybe it's not, if I were to bet, maybe I'd say it's not going to be a part of the way we live our lives, but in a crisis, which in Europe is in February and in the US is in August, can you deploy this enormous battery storage from vehicles to the grid? I could see us setting up ways to do that to keep the lights on, certainly.
I mean, well, there's a thing. I mean, Octopus are doing it now in this country already, and I've done 3 nights now where I don't use any power between. It's usually about 5:30 to 6:30 or 5 to 6 or whatever.
No, my wife sends me the results, and she's in the 92nd percentile. She gets very excited. I'm not sure she's doing it for the money though. I think she's sort of
no. I don't think you do it for them. It's like 50. I might get like 48 pence.
Exactly.
Off my electricity bill. It's not a lot of money, but it's a fascinating. Because it's at the moment. I think it's in the hundreds of thousands of people that are involved in that. But if you had 10 million households. That really reduce their consumption just for an hour at night when there is that peak, that would, it's. I think that's the thing that's emerging to my understanding is the combination of things. So all those things like, when I've done talks about electric cars, I always start. They're not the answer to everything. They're not the solution. They won't make the world better. They're still cars. They're made in factories out of materials we dig out of the ground. It's just that when you cycle behind one, you're not breathing in toxic gases. You can make that argument, but there's so many solutions that are emerging, and I think that's in a way why I remember talking to someone at your conference that if I'd gone to an energy conference, say 15 or 20 years ago, well, I wouldn't have gone because it would have been so boring. So it would have been people who run big power plants, talking to people who run the grid, talking to people who run local grids, and then a consumer awareness, or there would have been the most tedious thing, whereas it was like buzzing with excitement. The changes that are happening are very, very.
And the place the place that gives me the most confidence in the energy transition where I see that is graduate recruiting. As you say, in the 1990s, the sharpest graduates did not go and work for utilities. Didn't want to go in the energy.
No.
You go and work for Shell. You go and work for BP. You go on an oil rig in Nigeria, and you build your way up through this international the biggest companies in the world. The smart, we go through graduate recruiting. I meet them all at Aurora, and they're phenomenally clever, and they want to play a role in the energy transition. And the power sector is the place to be. And as I said before, this is not a fleeting. We've got a couple of decades worth of very difficult analytical questions to address. So I don't think it's going anywhere. But it's certainly reassuring. It's like slightly humbling when a bunch of really clever people turn up, and you have to make sure society benefits from their knowledge as well.
Well, I mean, that was certainly my experience there. I felt old and stupid at your conference because quite a lot of the people I spoke to, I thought, I'm like, my God, you're barely out of primary school, and you are talking in a language that is so sophisticated and well informed and intelligent. I mean, just go, oh my God.
This is basically my daily experience in general. Feeling old and stupid. So.
But there's a couple of other things I just want to, so the arguments around base load, because you mentioned that, and I cannot come up with, I cannot understand them, but there are people who argue quite strongly and with, intelligence that the notion of base load is is flawed. That that we can be 100% renewably powered, and we can we don't need base load, and because it's such a simple, strong argument. And I've become more suspicious of simple, strong arguments. Oh, well, obviously we need base load for when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. And you go, I've heard that too many times now. That's too easy, because there is other mitigating circumstances that we've just been discussing. But you still feel there is. It's not even whether you think that we have to have base load or not, but the general opinion amongst politicians, power industry, the network operators, everybody, is that we need base load. Is that still the kind of underlying thing?
No, I mean, there's nothing virtuous about. So a couple of observations on the point. There's nothing virtuous about baseload. Demand is not baseload.
No.
We need supply and demand to match at all periods of time, and storage is expensive. And then the system you build around that is really up to you. One of the most important properties of the system is inertia, and that is the responsive frequency to a mismatch in supply and demand, essentially. And when you close traditional, conventional thermal plants, whether that's nuclear, big spinning things, basically nuclear, gas, coal, then you get a bigger frequency response to that mismatch. But there are ways you can address that. It costs more money, but there are ways to address it. So no, there's nothing. When people start talking about needing baseload, it doesn't mean anything in a sense. There's nothing virtuous about baseload. As I say, demand isn't baseload, so why would supply need to be baseload in general? But it's often a shorthand for, we need high inertia on the system, or maybe it's renewables. We curtail them sometimes because we can't get them to market because we don't have the grid. So no, there is nothing. My view is there is absolutely nothing virtuous about baseload. It shouldn't be a policy target in general.
Right.
Nuclear's positive properties, and I think people would refer to it as a baseload technology, and it has a number of positive properties, but you wouldn't classify any of them as the fact that it's baseload. And to some extent, actually, the fact that it's inflexible is a negative. But what I would say, Robert, is I do think that when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, framing gets pilloried quite a bit in general. It is a fundamental problem.
We've just been through it.
So unfortunately, people consume electricity when the wind's not blowing, and when we have that week or two where the wind's not blowing, that is kind of the crux of the challenge of net zero. Yeah. So it slightly concerns me. I know it's rhetorically easy from a renewables perspective to say, look, I've heard the wind doesn't blow and sun doesn't shine critique before. That's nothing new. Part of the reason it keeps coming back is that it's just fundamental. And this is why we're talking about technologies like hydrogen that are 5x the cost of the substitute, because we take net zero seriously, but we don't really know how to keep the lights on when we're not producing from those very cheap variable renewable sources.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. Yeah, it is. I mean, I think one of the things that I've seen annoy people is it's sort of a lump of mansplaining annoyance is when someone goes, "Have you fancy eco warriors with your fancy wind turbines ever thought what happens?" Yes, but I went to a conference where that was the absolute central topic of thousands of people discussing it. Yes, we have thought about that. Yeah.
And as I say, frankly, it's kind of irrelevant. It's pretty irrelevant until you get up to a fairly high renewables penetration as well, Robert. Yeah. So to some extent, it is a fundamental challenge with net zero. It's probably the biggest challenge, one of the biggest challenges. It's how do we get the two biggest challenges are how do we get power from where it's generated to where it's consumed,
to where we use it,
and how do we get it from when it's generated to when it's consumed. And that's that latter one is the wind and the wind and the sun not producing at the same time. So they're the fundamental problems. But I don't know many power systems that have had that problem for the first 50% renewables in a sense. And to some extent that's history. We've benefited from a lot of investment in plant in history that's available there. It's hanging around. There are policies that enable it to hang around, that we can get through those periods. But they will get more problematic. And that's why we need to, we need the best minds thinking about, is it hydrogen? Yeah. What can EVs do in a crisis? What does CCUS do? Does that enable us to generate with a diesel plant and emit during
For that
those
short
hours,
time,
if we
yeah.
can save it up in those other hours. Where does nuclear fit in sort of easing the burden in those hours? So they're all really big, challenging questions. I don't have the answer to any of them. I've got some hypotheses, but it's certainly it's a big policy question.
But I think it was also I think that was at another conference years ago when someone said the first 100 gigawatt hours, that's easy. It's the last gigawatt hour is the real problem. We could, or whatever it was, the first 100 gigawatt or whatever, measurement you like to cause. It's that, we can produce a huge, we already now there will be days when we're producing a vast amount of renewable electricity we can't really use. I mean, I think that is the big challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. So there was this debate about levelized cost of electricity where it's like, hey, renewables are the cheapest. That's true.
Yeah.
For the first bunch. Yes. And that second point, Robert, which you've touched on, which I think is really important, is you increasingly see it. There are days when a huge amount of renewables are getting turned down because we can't get their power to market. The thing I would say, though, is in the future, curtailed renewables will be a feature of the system, not a bug. So there will always renewables are cheap. Network is expensive and hard to build from a public acceptance perspective.
Yeah.
And if that's the world that you're in, then you're going to overproduce in certain hours. And the right response is not to build enough network to cater to the highest output of your wind farms in Scotland or in West Texas or wherever it is. You're going to need to build a network that caters to it pretty well, knowing that certain times you're going to spill the load. So, so that's another of those shorthands. I think it's sort of you occasionally see people saying, we curtailed X amount of renewables in Scotland or in North Germany or in West Texas or wherever are these big renewable zones. Therefore, there's a problem with the system. Actually, the optimal system in the future will have curtailed renewables because building the network is expensive. We'd rather throw the power away, and renewables are sufficiently cheap than upgrade the whole network to get it to demand centers. Right.
That's. I mean, it's so. I've got one last thing I want to ask you about. Actually, it's two, but I'll try and keep them short. Well, the one is just terms that were used on your website, which I've never heard before, and I've got a feeling I may have heard people talking about them at the conference, which is price cannibalization and merchant risk. I think I know what merchant risk is, but I don't know what price cannibalization is.
Yeah.
I'm presuming in relation to renewables and what happens.
Yeah. I mean, so this renewables is in a sense the investor's side. It's what investors call that problem of wind curtailment to an extent. So, so historically, we had a power system where we built enough network, and so any power I generated from my coal or gas plant, I could sell to demand centers really without very much friction. And so the value of the power from any power station in the UK or Germany or wherever it was basically equivalent, right? We're now in a system where fundamentally power near demand centers, South Germany, London, or whatever it is more valuable than price that's generated very far away. When the wind blows in Scotland, there's so much wind in that part of the world or in West Texas is another really good example where there was a huge build out. The value of the power actually goes very low, like close to zero. And that's because it can't all get out. And so one thing that investors in wind and solar get worried about is the weather is correlated, particularly on a small island like Great Britain, but also, frankly, in the east coast of Australia. And so if I've got a solar farm and then a lot of other people build solar farms around me, then when the sun shines, the value of my power goes down a lot. So price cannibalization is at risk. Right. And there's enormous debate around how you reflect that. Right. And the US has gone for a very granular pricing approach where each different wind farm has a different price. It's called a nodal pricing market. Whereas in Europe, what they tend to do is pay all the wind farms in the UK the same price, right? And then they actually kind of do side payments behind the scenes that they socialize to consumers to kind of reflect actually the economics of generation in the different regions. So price cannibalization, more wind, more solar means the average price a wind farm or a solar farm goes down with every new investment. Merchant risk. that's power price risk. And the reason that's an important topic is leverage and debt is a big part of investment in renewables.
Yeah.
And historically, the business model, before renewables were really cost competitive, was before you built your wind farm or your solar farm, you would get a contract with government that guaranteed you payments for 15 years. Right, 15 years for a contract for difference in the UK, 20 years for a feed-in tariff. After that, you would then have to sell your power in the market, so it wasn't guaranteed. Right. That's the merchant risk involved. And in general, it's much harder to borrow money against merchant risk because some years the value of the power is very low, some years it's high. And so lenders say, well, this is a much more volatile revenue stream than if you've got the British government backing this payment. So they're sort of investor conceptualizations of issues that we see as consumers in power markets. Prices are volatile. We just look at our power bill now, and that's a problem to be navigated.
Yeah. John, I've got to let you go. I want you, please come back on the podcast again, because it is absolutely fascinating. Because I think for the general electricity consumer, it's a fascinating glimpse into a world that really is, you don't talk to individuals. You're talking to big companies and governments around the world, and we don't get to hear that generally as an electricity consumer. You don't know quite what's going on. You get your electricity bill and you moan about it. That's about the total. And I think what's interesting, what we're seeing shift is, and the people that we meet through making the show, who've got solar panels and batteries and electric cars, they're suddenly kind of more connected to it, which 20 years ago I wouldn't have known anything. And the thing is, I made TV shows where I'd go around power stations and film a big, like Drax B. I went around Drax B. I was there for 2 days, and oil refineries. It didn't click. I was interested in it. I was fascinated by the scale of it. It's just huge. I mean, Drax B, the generator hall in Drax B is mind-boggling. It makes Heathrow look like a garden shed. It's just huge. Yeah. But it then burnt millions of tons of coal every week. That was from Poland at the time when I filmed there. But anyway.
Interesting. Well, that could be a topic for a future one, is with the conversion to biomass and the role that Drax can have. It's a fascinating topic. In general as well. But
and there's also the company in the States that we're very keen to go and see, who are doing very deep geothermal. Have you heard about them? I can't remember the name of the company. But really, I don't know if it's going to work. But But fascinating stuff. But really, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come.
Well, thanks for having me on, Robert. It was great fun.
Well, I really hope you enjoyed that. It was fascinating talking to John. I want to get him back on the show, and I want to have him on panels at Fully Charged Live. I really hope he can do that. Just really interesting insights. And it's clearly, what is exciting about it is it's all changing. So however detailed the conversation got today, if we do this again in 6 months, it will be completely different. Other things will have happened, good and bad. It's a very, very volatile area. And exciting, and with enormous potential opportunities that we've got to grab. Anyway, that's all. Please do subscribe to the Fully Charged podcast. Tell your friends about the Fully Charged podcast. I think you can do a like and leave us a nice comment on your podcast download app if you want to. That would be nice. Give us one of those nice reviews that says we're nice. Some really exciting episodes coming soon. I know we're recording one this week. Can't wait. It's going to be amazing. And that's it. If you have been, thank you for listening.